The laughter echoed through the crystal chandelier ballroom, thick and suffocating. 300 elites mocking the fat girl in the torn silk dress. Then, the mahogany doors slammed open. The room froze. Chicago's most feared man walked straight past. The billionaires looked at her and changed her life forever. The Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago was a monument to old money and quiet power. On the night of the annual Caldwell and Associates Winter Gala, the grand ballroom was a sea of tailored Tom Ford tuxedos and slinky, custom-fitted Vera Wang gowns. It was a room where hedge fund managers from Citadel rubbed elbows with the mayor's aides, where millions of dollars were moved with a whisper over a glass of Macallan 25. And in the center of it all, completely invisible until she was a target, was Emma Jenkins. Emma was 28 years old, a senior forensic accountant, and the undisputed brains behind the firm's most complex audits. She was also a size 22 in a world that aggressively demanded a size 2. For tonight, Emma had spent 2 months of her savings on a custom-made emerald green silk dress. It had a sweetheart neckline that accentuated her curves, and for the first 10 minutes after she stepped out of her Uber, she felt genuinely beautiful. She felt like she belonged. But corporate high society is a ruthless ecosystem, and in their eyes, Emma was nothing more than the helper necessary overly large piece of office equipment who existed solely to fix their multi-million-dollar mistakes. She stood near the ice sculpture, sipping sparkling water, trying to blend into the velvet drapery. That was when Chad Dempsey spotted her. Chad was the firm's vice president of acquisitions. He was 30, built like a lacrosse player, and possessed a trust fund that insulated him from any real consequences. He was the kind of man who failed upward, relying entirely on Emma's late-night number crunching to cover up his disastrous quarterly losses. And he despised her for it. He despised that a fat, quiet woman from the south side of Chicago was smarter than him. Look who decided to emerge from her cubicle. Chad sneered, his voice carrying over the smooth jazz playing in the background. He was holding a tray of dark, blood-red Cabernet Sauvignon that he had just commandeered from a passing waiter. Emma's chest tightened. She offered a tight, polite smile. "Good evening, Chad. The gala is lovely." "Is it?" Chad stepped closer, his eyes raking over her full figure with undisguised disgust. "I'm surprised you found something to fit you. What is that custom upholstery? I think my grandmother has drapes in that exact same color." A few junior analysts standing nearby snickered. Emma felt the familiar hot sting of humiliation prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she held her ground. "Excuse me," she murmured, attempting to step around him. "I need to use the restroom." But Chad shifted, blocking her path. "Whoa, careful there. Wide load coming through." He didn't just stand in her way. With a deliberate, calculated flick of his wrist, Chad tilted the silver tray. 3 heavy crystal glasses of Cabernet tipped over, cascading perfectly down the front of Emma's emerald silk dress. The dark red stain blossomed instantly, ruining the delicate fabric seeping through to her skin. Emma gasped, stepping back, her hands flying to her chest. "Oh, my bad." Chad barked, his voice deliberately loud, drawing the attention of the surrounding executives. "Jesus, Emma, it's like trying to navigate around a parade float. You've got to stop taking up 3 zip codes of floor space. I couldn't even see the waiter past you." The music seemed to dip. The conversation in the immediate vicinity stopped, replaced by a ripple of cruel, unrestrained laughter. Emma looked around, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She saw Brittany, the head of HR, covering her mouth to hide a giggle. She saw Richard Caldwell, the CEO of the company, shaking his head with a slight, amused smirk on his face. Not a single person stepped forward. Not a single person offered her a napkin. To the elite of Chicago's financial district, this wasn't cruelty. It was entertainment. She was the fat girl, the punching bag, the joke. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her face burned crimson. She wanted the polished marble floor to crack open and swallow her whole. She wrapped her arms around her heavy waist, trying to hide the massive stained tears blurring her vision. She took a trembling step backward, preparing to flee, to run out into the freezing Chicago snow and never come back. But before her heel could even touch the ground for a second step, the heavy double mahogany doors of the ballroom slammed open with a deafening crack. The laughter died instantly. The temperature in the room plummeted. The smooth jazz band fumbled the saxophonist, choking on a note as the doors rebounded off the walls. Standing in the threshold was Dominic Nico Romano. He was a ghost story whispered in the boardrooms of the Gold Coast. At 35, Nico Romano was the ruthless, undisputed head of the Romano Syndicate. On paper, he owned a vast empire of commercial real estate and shipping logistics. In reality, he controlled the city's underground economy, the trade ports, and the shadow banking systems that funded half the politicians in the room. He was built like a heavyweight fighter, trapped in a bespoke, jet-black Brioni suit with a jawline carved from granite and eyes as dark and unforgiving as a starless night. He didn't walk. He stalked into the room, flanked by 4 massive men whose tailored jackets barely concealed the firearms strapped to their ribs. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the Palmer house. You could hear a pin drop. Billionaires suddenly found the floor incredibly interesting. The mayor's aides subtly backed away toward the exits. Richard Caldwell, sweating profusely, shoved his way to the front. His previous amusement entirely vanished. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Mr. Romano. Caldwell stammered, his voice cracking. We weren't expecting you. What an honor. Please let me get you a drink. Nico didn't even look at him. He didn't blink. He walked right past the CEO of the company, as if Caldwell were a piece of cheap furniture. His dark eyes were locked on only one person in the room, Emma. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Emma stood completely frozen, the red wine dripping from her ruined dress onto the marble floor. She was terrified. She had audited accounts connected to Romano shell companies. She knew exactly how dangerous the man walking toward her was. Nico stopped less than 2 feet away from her. Up close, he was towering, his presence radiating a raw, lethal electricity. He looked at the massive red stain on her dress. Then he looked at her face, his gaze tracing the tears pooling in her eyes, the trembling of her full lips, the defensive way she wrapped her arms around her curves. Slowly, deliberately, Nico reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pristine, white linen handkerchief. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he stepped into her personal space, his large, calloused hand gently lifting her chin. He carefully dabbed the stray tear from her cheek. The touch was impossibly gentle for a man who ordered assassinations over breakfast. Then, Nico shrugged off his $6,000 Brioni jacket. He stepped behind Emma and draped the heavy, warm fabric over her shoulders, pulling the lapels together at the front to completely hide the wine stain. The jacket engulfed her, carrying the scent of expensive cedar and danger. He stepped back around to face her, his eyes softening just a fraction, exclusively for her. I've spent the last 3 weeks tearing through Caldwell's encrypted ledgers. Nico's voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried perfectly in the dead, silent room. I saw the $20 million magically siphoned into offshore Cayman accounts. I saw the absolute incompetence of the executives running this pathetic firm. But more importantly, Nico turned his head, his dark, dead eyes sweeping over the terrified crowd before locking on to Chad Dempsey, who looked like he was about to vomit. I saw the digital footprints of the only genius keeping this sinking ship from hitting the ocean floor. I saw an accountant doing the work of 3 partners, hiding the sins of stupid boys and working until 2 in the morning every single night. Nico turned his attention back to Emma. He leaned in his voice, dropping to a low, intimate timbre, yet loud enough for the trembling executives to hear every word. "So tell me, Emma," Nico asked, his tone laced with genuine perplexity and quiet fury. "Why are you shedding tears for dead men?" The entire ballroom collectively stopped breathing. What?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, clutching his jacket around her. "These men." Nico gestured vaguely to Caldwell and Chad without looking at them. "They are bankrupt, morally, intellectually, and as of 30 seconds ago, financially. I just liquidated Caldwell and Associates. They owe me $40 million and they don't have it." Caldwell let out a strangled gasp, collapsing to his knees. "Please, Mr. Romano. I can get the money, I just need time." Nico ignored the pathetic pleading. He took a step toward Chad, who was shaking so violently the empty wine tray rattled in his hands. "You think she takes up too much space?" Nico's voice was barely a whisper now, but it sliced through the room like a razor. "She is the only reason your trust fund wasn't seized by the feds 6 months ago. She holds more power, more intelligence, and more worth in her little finger than your entire bloodline." Nico reached out, grabbed the back of Chad's neck with one massive hand, and forced the vice president to his knees, right in front of Emma. "Clean it up," Nico ordered, his voice devoid of mercy. "Wait, what?" Chad whimpered. "You spilled wine on my accountant," Nico said, drawing a sleek, silver-suppressed pistol from his waistband and casually tapping it against Chad's temple. "Use your tongue if you have to. Clean the floor." As the arrogant golden boy of the firm began frantically wiping the marble floor with his silk tie, sobbing quietly, Nico turned his back on him. He extended a large, scarred hand toward Emma. "You don't work for them anymore." "Mia bella," Nico said softly, using a term of endearment that made Emma's heart skip a violent beat. "You work for me now. And in my house, queens do not bow to jesters. Are you coming?" Emma looked at the terrified elites who had mocked her for years. She looked at the man on his knees. Then she looked at the ruthless Mafia boss offering her a kingdom. She placed her hand in his. The ride from the Palmer House, Hilton, to the Gold Coast was a blur of adrenaline and hyperventilation. Emma sat in the back of a bulletproof Mercedes Maybach, the buttery leather seating, a stark contrast to the rough, violent turn her life had just taken. The heavy Brioni suit jacket still hung over her shoulders, drowning her emerald dress and smelling faintly of gunpowder and expensive cedar. Beside her sat Dominic Nico Romano. He was entirely still watching the slick, snow-covered streets of Chicago glide past the tinted windows. He didn't speak, granting her the silent grace to process the fact that she had just walked out of her corporate life and into the epicenter of the city's criminal underworld. They arrived at the street. Regis Chicago, pulling into a private subterranean garage, heavily guarded by men who looked like they belonged to a private military contractor rather than a valet service. "You are safe here," Nico said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet cabin. It was the first time he had spoken since the ballroom. "No one from Caldwell and Associates will ever breathe your name again. I give you my word on that. I audited your front companies." Emma blurted out, the panic finally breaching her throat. She gripped the edges of his jacket. I know about the shell corporations in Delaware. I know about the offshore routing through the Cayman branches of J.P. Morgan Chase. I know too much." "Is that why you took me?" Nico turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The overhead garage lights cast sharp shadows across his jawline. "If I wanted to silence you, Emma, you would have disappeared quietly on your commute home 3 weeks ago. I brought you here because you are a genius. You saw through financial architectures designed by ex-Goldman Sachs bankers, and you did it from a cubicle while being actively sabotaged by a trust fund idiot." He stepped out of the car, extending a hand to her. "I don't want you dead. I want you to work for me." The penthouse was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the icy expanse of Lake Michigan. It was impeccably clean, minimalist, and terrifyingly cold. Nico's housekeeper, a stoic older woman named Sophia, immediately ushered Emma into a guest suite that was larger than her entire South Side apartment. When Emma woke the next morning, the ruined emerald dress was gone. In its place, laid meticulously across the king-sized bed, was a curated wardrobe. But this wasn't the standard generic selection of plus-size clothing she was used to fighting for in department stores. These were custom-tailored pieces: a charcoal grey cashmere wrap coat, wide-leg wool trousers from Marina Rinaldi, and silk blouses cut perfectly to accommodate her heavy bust and wide hips without looking like a tent. They were clothes designed for a woman who took up space and commanded it. She dressed her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the luxurious fabrics over her curves. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she needed to shrink. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman of substance. Nico was waiting for her in his home office, a sprawling room dominated by a massive mahogany desk and 6 glowing computer monitors. "Take a seat," Nico commanded, gently gesturing to the ergonomic leather chair beside him. "Let me show you the real books." For the next 2 weeks, Emma barely left the penthouse. She was plunged into a financial ecosystem so vast and complex it made Caldwell and Associates look like a lemonade stand. Nico Romano didn't just run numbers rackets. He owned a significant percentage of Chicago's commercial real estate, managed a fleet of transatlantic shipping vessels, and controlled a shadow banking syndicate that rivaled the GDP of small nations. But as she dug deeper, utilizing advanced forensic software to track encrypted transactions through the dark web, she noticed a disturbing pattern. "Nico," she called out one evening. It was 1 a.m. Rain lashed against the glass walls of the penthouse. Nico emerged from the kitchen holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He walked over, handing her one, his presence a heavy, comforting weight at her side. He had taken to lingering near her while she worked, watching her fingers fly across the keyboard with intense fascination. He never made comments about her diet, never suggested she take the stairs instead of the elevator, never treated her body as a problem to be solved. He treated her like a queen, orchestrating a war. "What did you find?" he asked, leaning over her chair, his chest brushing her shoulder. "Your internal auditors told you that the $10 million deficit in the shipping logistics division was due to inflation and rising port tariffs, correct?" "Yes." Nico's jaw tightened. Arthur, my lead counsel, verified it. "Arthur is lying," Emma said, her voice steady, confident. She tapped the screen, pulling up a deeply buried ledger she had decrypted, using cross-reference analysis from old SEC filings. The money wasn't lost to tariffs. It was systematically siphoned, tranche by tranche, structured in increments of just under $9.999 to avoid federal flagging. Nico's eyes darkened. "Where did it go?" "That's the twist," Emma said, her heart hammering, as she pulled up the final routing numbers. "It didn't go to the feds. It didn't go to an offshore account. It was routed back domestically, to a holding company registered in Delaware. Whose holding company? Nico's voice was dangerously quiet. Emma swallowed hard. Declan O'Connor, the head of the West Side Irish Syndicate. The silence in the room was absolute. Nico's knuckles turned white around his coffee mug. O'Connor was his fiercest rival, a man who had been slowly encroaching on Romano territory for months. And who authorized these transfers? Nico asked. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The authorization codes match the digital signature of the external auditing firm, hired to manage your legitimate fronts. She paused, her breath catching. Caldwell and Associates. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Chad Dempsey and Richard Caldwell weren't just incompetent. They were traitors. They had been actively stealing from the most dangerous man in Chicago, funneling his money to his mortal enemy. And there's more, Emma whispered, her hands shaking as she pulled up one final document. Look at the IP address attached to the phantom account used to frame the theft. They tied the embezzlement to my employee ID. If the feds or your men ever caught the discrepancy, they were going to use me as the scapegoat. I was going to take the fall for all of it. Nico stared at the screen. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. When he finally looked down at Emma, the cold, calculating mob boss was gone, replaced by a man radiating pure, apocalyptic fury. He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He gently reached out his thumb, tracing the soft curve of her jaw, his eyes burning with a dark, violent promise. "Pack up your laptop, Mia Bella," Nico whispered. "We are going to a meeting." The abandoned shipping warehouse at the port of Chicago was a cavernous tomb of rusted steel and echoing shadows. Outside, the freezing rain turned to sleet, battering the corrugated metal roof. Inside, the only light came from the harsh glare of halogen work lamps set up in a circle on the concrete floor. In the center of that circle sat Richard Caldwell and Chad Dempsey, bound tightly to metal folding chairs. They were bruised, battered, and weeping openly. Nico's men had pulled them from their beds at 3 a.m., dragging them into the nightmare they thought they had cleverly avoided. A sleek black Maybach pulled directly into the warehouse, the engine a low, predatory purr. The doors opened. Nico stepped out first. He looked like the Grim Reaper in a tailored overcoat, but he didn't walk toward the prisoners. He turned and offered his hand to the woman emerging from the back seat. Emma stepped into the harsh halogen light. She was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored burgundy trench coat that cinched at her waist, highlighting her curves. Her hair was blown out, her posture straight. She held a black leather folio under her arm. She didn't look like the terrified, bullied accountant from the Palmer house. She looked like the reigning queen of the Romano Empire. Chad looked up through a swollen eye. He gasped, choking on his own spit. "Say, Emma. Oh, thank God, Emma. Please tell him we didn't do it. Tell him it's a mistake." Emma walked forward, the clicking of her heels echoing like gunshots against the concrete. Nico walked a half-step behind her, a silent, lethal guardian, granting her the floor. She stopped 10 feet from her former tormentors. She looked at Chad, remembering the wine poured down her dress, the fat jokes, the years of soul-crushing humiliation. She felt no pity. "I did what you always asked me to do, Chad," Emma said, her voice ringing out smooth and steady. "I checked your math. As usual, it was remarkably sloppy." She opened the leather folio. "On October 14th, you initiated a wire transfer of $2, $4 million to a dummy corporation under Declan O'Connor's control." Emma read her eyes, scanning the terrified men. "You hid it under a fictitious equipment depreciation log. On November 2nd, Caldwell authorized another $4 million, masking it as legal retainer fees for a firm in Boston that hasn't existed since 1998. No, Caldwell sobbed, pulling desperately against his zip ties. O'Connor made us do it. He said he'd kill our families. That's a lie, Emma snapped, snapping the folio shut. I audited your personal accounts, Richard. 3 days after every transfer to O'Connor, a 20% kickback was deposited into your private offshore trust in Belize. You weren't coerced. You were profiting. Chad began to hyperventilate. Emma, please. We're colleagues. We're friends. I was just joking at the gala. It was just a joke. You tried to frame me, Emma said softly, the betrayal tasting like ash in her mouth. You linked the IP addresses of the stolen funds to my desktop. You were going to let the Romano Syndicate murder me so you could buy a new yacht. She turned to Nico. Her part was done. The math was finalized. The ledger was balanced. The audit is complete, Mr. Romano, Emma said, her voice unwavering. Nico stepped forward, his eyes locked on the 2 men who had dared to touch what was his. He drew the heavy, suppressed pistol from his shoulder holster. You called her a parade float, Nico said to Chad, his voice devoid of all human emotion. You laughed at her. You thought she was nothing because she didn't fit into your pathetic, shallow worldview. But while you were drinking my stolen champagne, she was outsmarting you. She holds my empire together, and you are just a rounding error. Nico raised the weapon. Wait! Chad screamed. Please! Foot! Foot! 2 muffled shots echoed through the warehouse. The 2 executives slumped forward in their chairs, silent forever. The massive debt was finally settled. Nico holstered his weapon smoothly. He didn't look at the bodies. He turned entirely to Emma. The harsh warehouse lights caught the terrifying, awe-inspiring devotion in his dark eyes. He stepped close to her, the smell of cordite mixing with his cedar cologne. He reached out his large hands, cupping her face, his thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones. Are you okay? He asked, his voice returning to that low, gentle timbre reserved only for her. Emma looked at the wreckage of her past life, and then up at the ruthless king who had handed her the crown. Her heart didn't flutter with fear. It soared with absolute, undeniable power. I'm perfectly balanced, Emma whispered. Nico smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his hardened face. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle testing kiss. It was a claiming. It was a promise signed in blood and billions. He kissed her with a fierce, consuming hunger, his hand sliding down to grip her thick waist, holding her securely against his solid frame, as if she were the most precious, perfect treasure he had ever stolen. Every man in the room had laughed at her. But as Emma kissed the most dangerous boss in Chicago, knowing she commanded both his heart and his empire, she knew exactly who had the last laugh. Did you love seeing Emma get her ultimate revenge and find a man who worships her exactly as she is? The corporate elites thought she was just a joke, but she proved that true power lies in brilliant minds and unshakable confidence. If you couldn't get enough of this mafia romance drama and want more stories of unstoppable queens taking back their power, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more thrilling real-life stories.